Take it. Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Behavioral Grooves brings a behavioral science lens to understanding why we do the things we do through interesting conversations with our guests. We started out as a whim like a year and a half ago, and it's grown into a movement. We have groovers listening now in over 100 countries and counting.
And we just heard from one of them. Rich Henderson, who is from England, was interested in our conversation about having enough meat in the sauce. That was Steven Sisler, right?
Yeah, Steve Sisler said that. Yeah, which is
so
cool.
He brought up the idea and presented a different angle, which I had not thought about before. And it was this idea that we may be self-deprecating, i.e. not having enough meat in the sauce, as a form of social cohesion.
Yeah, Rich's comments were particularly insightful. He mentioned Elliot Aronson's study on people liking you better if you made a blunder, like spilling coffee on your suit.
Aronson, who did that work at the University of Minnesota?
Exactly. And this idea traces all the way back to the founding of Stoicism by the Greek philosopher Zeno of Citium some 5,000 years ago.
Who?
Yeah, I know. It was Zeno of Citium.
Wow.
Yeah. So we always rely on a little bit of self-deprecation from time to time in order to keep us humble, but also to build social bonds by signaling to others that we're doing the same.
Which is what we are doing when we publicly dismiss our ability or our work. Our dismissing of a compliment is a way to build that social cohesion. So thank you, Rich. Thanks for bringing us this idea and to getting us to think about it in a new way and to starting that conversation. Please keep those emails coming.
Please do. All right. Okay. But let's talk about this episode with our old friend, Paul Hebert.
All right.
Paul is an expert in human motivation and incentives, having worked for many years in the incentive industry. He is currently the Vice President of Individual Performance Strategy at Creative Group. And he's been interviewed on the BBC and USA Today. He's also a contributor to Fistful of Talent blog and HR Examiner website. He is a busy guy.
He is a busy guy. I encourage our listeners to check out both Fistful of Talent and HR Examiner. Great publications. Have a lot of really good information out there. And our conversation with Paul is focused around an eBook that Tim and I co-authored with him.
It was fun.
About the 7 deadly sins of incentives. Our conversation is a little more structured than a normal podcast that we do, but still we get to talk about a lot of different ideas and about how companies can address those 7 sins.
And, it's just always fun to have a conversation with Paul.
It is.
So remember, we want to hear from you and your ideas, or better yet, maybe meet you in person.
That would be awesome.
Which we could do if you're in the Philadelphia area on the 17th of October 2019, when we're doing a live recording session for our 100th episode with Annie Duke, Michael Halsworth, and Jeff Chrysler.
He's the funny guy, right?
He is. He's definitely a funny guy.
All right. Our 100th episode extravaganza. And you know what? We'd love for you to be there, but if you can't find the time to drive there, don't have the money to fly there, guess what? If you're not in Philly, you can listen in to the live broadcast of this through our sponsor Podbean, and it'll start at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so you can listen in live to our 100th episode extravaganza. All right. So, and the links and everything will be found in the show notes. And
Absolutely.
So please look there, or you can always go out to www.behavioralgrooves.com. Information will be out there too. But it's on October 17th, 2019, starting at 7 p.m. So whatever that translates to your time zone, make a note, put that on, and listen in if you can't make it to Philly. And so with that, we invite you to get sinful with us as we have our fun conversation with Paul Hebert.
Paul Hebert, welcome to the Behavioral Grooves podcast.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It is so good to have you here, and we want to start with a speed round.
We want to start with a speed round?
Let's do. Something different, right?
Something different. All right, Paul.
Okay.
Coffee or tea? Preference?
Coffee. No doubt.
Okay.
100%.
Would you prefer to go up the mountain or down the mountain?
Oh, down.
All right.
I don't know what that means psychologically, but definitely easier.
Cocktail at night or beer?
Oh, cocktail.
Yeah.
Is it better to ask for forgiveness or to avoid an incentive design sin altogether?
I was going to initially say the latter because I don't like making mistakes, but sometimes a mistake leads you to an epiphany. So I don't know if I would pick either or. I think it's one of those things that experiments are fun. So I guess if I knew ahead of time it was going to fail, I'd say no. I'd go with I'd avoid the mistake if I knew ahead of time it was going to fail.
Thanks for a short, concise answer on that, Paul. Appreciate that.
Well, so much for the speed round, right?
Yeah.
Hey, speed is a relative term, right? In the overall lifespan of our lives, that was just a fraction of a moment. So.
That's right.
Okay. Well, Paul, we have known each other for years. We've talked to each other about various different things. You are an expert on incentives and kind of by default then what drives human motivation and a variety of different things. We've had lots of conversations around Cialdini and influence and other things throughout the years. But Tim and I co-authored a white paper with you about 7 deadly sins of incentives. And we did a short little webinar about that as well. And we just had so much fun. We said, hey, got to get Paul on the show.
Why not? And I'm cheap, right? So why not?
But I would say inexpensive.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm a value.
Value acquisition. There you go.
Exactly. No, it was fun. It was good. You guys did
how about if we trip through the sins for our listening audience?
Absolutely, because we everybody likes to know when you're sinning, right? So yes.
Well, sins are the fun part, right? Isn't that? Yeah, sinning is the fun part. That's why we do it.
If you don't know when you're sinning, how can you ask for atonement?
Well, and most of us wouldn't be here if it wasn't for a few of those sins, right? So,
all right. So just and again, you can go out and we'll have links to this in the show notes. But we can definitely send anybody the paper, and you can get linked to the webinar that we did around this. But the sins, just in order of how we wrote them, incentives are rewards for top performers only. That's one of the sins. Spread goals evenly among each rep. That's sin number 2. Sin number 3, use the budget for a single grand reward. You want to make that one big kind of component out there. Sin number 4, you must be above quota to earn the reward. We'll get into that one because it's cool. Sin number 5, we'll figure it out behind the scenes. Don't worry about being transparent. Sin number 6, we can't let a low performer be the top winner in the contest. And finally, sin number 7, it's all about the Benjamins.
Money.
Yep.
So let's talk about number 1. Let's talk about number 1, Paul. Top performers only. What do you think about this idea of having a rule structure that says, man, we just got to make sure that it's really about the top performers, so the incentive really rewards the big dogs that are dragging the sled?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think there's always this discussion about, incentive versus recognition. I think this is where this gets conflated and entangled. So people look at, say, I want to run a program, but I want to make sure that I reward my top performers because they're important to me as a company. They bring in, the 80-20 rule is probably in effect in 90% of these companies. So, this idea of rewarding your top performer isn't a bad idea. It's the application again, right? So most of this stuff is that they all have a grain of good idea in them, but they're applied poorly. And this is one of those I think we see so often, is that a company will say, I want to run, quote unquote, an incentive program. So I'm going to take my top 10 people to Hawaii, or I'm going to give them all, iPods or whatever or iPhones, whatever the hot thing is this week. And in their minds, they're thinking that this is going to motivate everybody in their audience because the award is so great that they're going to work real hard. And as we all know, every organization, every sales team, every channel follows that 80-20, and it probably has some sort of normal distribution of performance. So the reality is, as soon as you launch a program that says, I'm going to reward 10 people, or 10% or whatever the number is, the other 90% say, or I'd say maybe 87%, because there's always that 3% that hovers around that break point, that they might win. The rest of them are like, oh, that's great. I'll see you next year. So you really have created a program that potentially could lower your overall sales, because the top 10% of the top 10 probably are going to be the same people that would have been there last year. And it's not a bad idea. It's just not a good incentive program.
I agree. The key thing here that I think people miss out is that you are limiting the motivational impact to a relatively small group of people who believe that they can actually win. Yeah. And that is, if you go back to goal setting theory, one of the things that is really key in goal setting theory is this element of, I have to believe that goal is achievable. And if if I'm not in that top, as you said, 13, 15, 20%, and it's a top 10% people earn, then what you've actually done is just said, you're not even going to be eligible for this. And to a certain degree, that can actually be disengaging. Right. And so you're not only not engaging them, but you might be disengaging them because they're feeling like their needs are not being met and that the company is not even paying attention to them.
Especially if you're even close, right? I mean, if you're bouncing up near that top 10%, say you're at 85%, you may never hit that top 10%, but boy, you would still maybe make one more sales call. But now you're saying, the heck with it. I'm not going to bother. So yeah, I mean, like I said, overall, you could lower your entire sales curve. Yeah, your top performers are still going to be your top performers. And I think, again, the idea is not a bad. There's nothing wrong with recognizing your top performers. But I think we have to understand that that's a retention play. It's not a motivation and incentive play. In other words, keep those folks that are doing a good job, make them happy, recognize them. We want to make sure that they don't leave. I mean, that's the core, right? Whether it's your distribution or your top salesperson, you want to build a relationship with them so that you have an emotional connection and they don't walk out the door. So that's a very different strategy and a different goal than I want to have everybody sell 10 more units or 10% more. Very different goal.
Yeah, and it's not a nuance. I just want to reinforce this idea that the difference between recognition and incentive is not just a tiny little thing. It's actually a pretty damn big difference. Yep. And really worthy. I like the way you called that out, Paul, because I think that it's a great strategy to recognize top performers. That's terrific. It's a whole variety of reasons that you want to recognize everyone in the sales force for different purposes. But recognizing top performers is terrific. It just doesn't need to be, cloaked as an incentive program, because that's really not the point.
Well, and we talked with Michael Ahern and Tom Steenberg, who did some really great research on this motivational component. They talk about stars and laggards and cores, and the idea is that you need all three groups really to be pulling forward. And if you're only incentivizing those stars, those top performers, you are missing out. So you need to have that move the middle kind of component in a way to solve for this, is really build those incentives to drive motivation at all levels within the organization. That's not saying that you give the same huge award to somebody that's down at the bottom, but you do need to give them an opportunity to earn that is going to be meaningful for them.
Yeah.
So no doubt about it.
So speaking of Steenberg and Ahern's work, let's talk about the second sin. This whole idea about spreading the goals around.
See, I'm glad you right into that.
You absolutely did. It was perfect. And do we expect anything different from Kurt? Just lay the foundation, make it smooth, make it easy.
So this is the peanut butter goals, right? You just get that glob of peanut butter and you spread out those goals evenly across the entire sales force so that there's no clumps, no globes, right?
Yeah, I mean, what are you going to do, right? I mean, everybody thinks that's the logical way to do it, is I have a 10% increase, I'll give everybody a 10% increase and away we go. It's crazy. It's like they didn't pass the math class in college, I guess. I don't know.
but you talked about this earlier. There's a kernel of kind of, that makes sense, right? It's fair. It is perceptually fair to people. You can explain it. Look, The company needs to grow 10%. Everybody in the sales force needs to grow 10%. This is an equal opportunity goal for everybody. It shouldn't be seen as anything but that.
Right.
Yet, we know that doesn't really work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I always like to look at it this way. You take your top performer, just like we were talking about with sin number one, rewarding, calling a recognition program for your top performers an incentive program. One of the problems with setting goals like that is think about your top performers who are out there probably, I always like to say, is not having a lot of headroom. In other words, they're selling at a very high level. They are killing it usually year after year. And for them, say they have $1 million book of business, to move that 10%, that's $100,000 increase. But they're probably pushing up against maybe their theoretical limit of what they can sell. Whereas somebody else who's just starting out in a brand new territory that's never had this product or service, $100,000 to them could be absolutely nothing. They could do that by just answering the phone twice a day. So how does that 10% make any sense at all? So you're now going to demotivate your top performer by giving them the same goal that you're giving somebody with a brand new territory that's, and 20 new leads. I keep thinking of Glengarry again, Ross, right? They get all the better leads. So, yeah, I mean,
all the good metaphors come from movies, don't they?
I think so. It's just there is no new art, right? And art imitates life. So it's kind of this whole circle. But yeah, I think we always try to find this path of least resistance in a lot of these programs. And it's like you say, it makes sense, and it makes just enough sense that I can sell it. And people will buy off on the budget, and they say, okay, go do that. And then they sit back and wonder, how come this just didn't work the way I thought it would? Well, we're talking about human beings at the end of the day. And that's always a fun thing for me, is that we keep thinking human beings will react predictably. And we now know, with all the behavioral economics stuff that's now being talked about, I think Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational, says it best. I mean, it's the best title in forever, I think. But they don't work that way. So yeah, spreading it around.
And one thing I want to say, I mean, you talked about potentially, being unfair to the top performers. And I think most people go, the research that I've seen with clients that I've worked with is oftentimes it's actually the top performers who have the ability to grow even higher because of the marketplace that they're in. And sometimes that's the case as well. So it's not just this component of saying, oh, well, top performers, because they're nearing that top, they need a lesser goal, and those bottom performers don't. You have to look at the context with which your business operates. And so that's the piece that I think we often miss out. We don't go in and we don't say, territory A, you're at $1 million, but man, your opportunity here is really 1.5 million. And we're only asking you to grow 10%. That's territory B, you're at 200,000, but man, it's going to be really hard to get up to 220 just because of the dynamics there, or vice versa, just as you were saying. So that understanding of the territory dynamics and the sales opportunities within those is really what you need to be looking at when you're doing goal setting and spreading those out.
Context matters. That's
Sure.
It comes back to context. You have to look at the individual territories, and you need to be making sensible, rational decisions as a sales manager about what's going to work and how it's going to work on an individual territory basis.
Yeah, but Tim, that means they have to work harder.
Yeah, it does. It does. It absolutely does. And I realize sales managers are called upon to be psychologists and economists and mathematicians and all kinds of crazy things, as well as babysitters. It's not an easy job, but part of the job is to actually just do it. And if you want to do it well, you're going to have to actually take these things into consideration.
But one of the funny things about all of these things, when we talked about it when we put the deck together, was originally that this idea that it takes work. But I've found over the years that if you do that work the first time out of the box, it gets easier each time. So it's kind of like learning any new skill, right? You come down that learning curve. So yeah, it feels a little rough the first time out of the box, and we don't have the data pulled together right now, or we don't have a Salesforce person that can put together that report for me. But the minute you get one, Now, the next time you do it, you've kind of come down that curve a little bit. It gets easier and easier. So I always try to convince my clients, at least do it the one time I'm asking you to.
Yeah.
Because believe
Just
me,
try
next
it.
year, you're going to be going, how do we slice and dice this differently and better so that we can set, because now they're into it. They see it works.
Yeah. Just the last piece on the goal piece there is in all of the work that I've done interviewing sales folks, the number one complaint is about goals and goals being unfair. And it is the biggest contributor to dissatisfaction around the sales plan. Even sometimes we talk about sales managers. Oftentimes sales managers don't have any input onto the goals, and it's driven through, finance and forecasting and a variety of other factors. And so really making sure that when you are building out these goals as an organization, that you take the nuances into consideration and you're looking at this, because it really can be huge dissatisfier for the sales force. All right. Sin number 3.
Let's talk about this whole idea of just having a great big single award for the top winner. The sales manager just got back from Hawaii and was like, man, this is fabulous. I don't have enough budget to, really spend on really cool awards for the top 10, but we could just send the top performer to Hawaii. It'd be awesome. What do you think about that, Paul? Pretty great idea? Or is it a big old sin?
Well, this is one of those that really shouldn't make sense to anybody the minute they think it up. But for some reason, it's still, some of these other ones I can kind of understand. There's some logic there. There might be a little bit of soft edges around it. But this one's pretty set and cut and dried that, one big award for one person, or even a very, very few, even if you do first, second, and third, that to me, that's just so out of the ballpark as far as a good design. But I do think that it happens because in a lot of cases, we start to look at our own history, like we talked about in the white paper, this idea that because I think it's a motivation and I had earned it, then everybody else will too. So we start to fall into those biases and those traps about how we make decisions. And this is one where I just think I find it difficult to believe that they do it, and it still happens with all the evidence out there that says this is just a bad idea. But again, I keep coming back to a path of least resistance, and it's the idea that and I think this is funny because I think in our industry, or my industry, our collective idea of motivating behaviors, most people think because I'm human and because I feel this way, therefore I know what other people are going to do, because obviously I'm human. So what I think has value, even though they haven't read one paper on how people really behave and how they make decisions and what the biases are, and a lot of them are subconscious, right? So they don't even know they're happening, but they think they're right. And I think this is, again, one of those program types that comes from, because I think it's right and I'm human and it motivated me, must be a good structure. Right?
So I will go back to a movie reference, right? You already brought up this movie.
Yes.
Glengarry Glen Ross, right? Hey, First place, brand new Cadillac Eldorado. Second place, this wonderful set of steak knives. Third place, you're fired, right? But to that degree, and we laugh at that. Everybody laughs at that. And yet these types of programs get put in, maybe not the fired part, but for third place, but still.
I had a client who had recently gotten his, he's a guy in his 50s. He recently got his motorcycle license, and he bought a big Harley, and he was like, oh, the number one prize for this contest should be a Harley. That's what we should do. We should, in fact, everybody's going to want that. And I scratched my head and then said, so what percentage of the population already has their motorcycle license? And he said, well, like somewhere between 15 and 20%. And I said, and do you think that applies to your sales organization? And he stopped for a minute and he said, okay, I get it. But then he still put it on it was like a bonus for the top performer. He ended up splitting the budget around a variety of things. And interestingly enough, the winner was like a soccer mom from Dallas, whose brother had been killed on a motorcycle.
Oh,
so it was like, ouch! You didn't really think through that properly.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, talk about unintended consequences of a program, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and to that component, Paul, you mentioned like why would anybody even think about this? And I think there are some psychological components to this, right? Where you have a large, huge award, it does draw attention, right?
Yeah.
You can garner attention with that award, and it draws
It's
people's
vivid.
eyeballs to it. It's vivid.
Yeah.
It gets their attention. That being said, all these other factors that we've talked about kind of lend itself into, yeah, but I don't want that, or B, there's no way I'm going to earn that, and all of the factors that we've just talked about.
And Mike Ahern and Tom Steenberg's work points to this. They've actually done the study to actually demonstrate the differences in performance between groups where only the top performer is rewarded and when the top 10 performers are rewarded with exactly the same total spend. And the results are dramatic. When you spend the same amount of dollars on 10, when you split up a big budget and you divide it evenly between 10 people, you get more performance.
Yes.
So that's okay. What's number 4?
Sin number 4, you must be above quota in order to earn the reward.
Well, that sounds pretty easy. I mean, if I were a sales manager, I don't want to reward those lowlifes that aren't a quota, right?
Of course. Why not?
Well, it all depends on your goals, right? And I think this is, again, it gets back to the whole design process is, what are you trying to accomplish? Are there other things besides just that one thing that we want to make sure that we reward? And therefore, you could have people that are doing, everything you want right, but for whatever reason, they're not going to hit that goal, or they're not going to be above the quota, but that doesn't mean they didn't do what you wanted. We all know sales is somewhat cyclical to a certain degree. We also know that salespeople have other things to do besides just close deals. Again, this gets, I always hate these kinds of things because they get back to, and I just wrote about this the other day on my blog, is that we focus so much on outcomes when it comes to rewards, is that above quota becomes that criteria, right? But it has nothing to do with what that person did, the behaviors they exhibited, the effort they put into it. It's just an outcome. It just happened. And there's just so many of these programs where, I get that you want to make sure that everybody's above quota and that that's the only way you can earn. But there's 100 other things they could be doing that may or may not impact quota today, but it'll impact quota tomorrow. So it's just this idea, again, of getting back to make it easy, make it simple. I mean, we're talking, all of these sins end up coming back to, I'm worried about complicating things. And I want to make sure, it's simple for me to sell up. It's simple for me to launch and talk about. I think we underestimate the intelligence of the people we're trying to influence out there.
Well, we underestimate the intelligence of people, and also the ability that we have by being effective communicators and communicating these out in an effective way. I think I want to be very clear in our communication on this. When we're talking incentives, we are talking short-term incentives.
Yeah.
Above quota to pay out for your annual incentive or your quarterly bonus plan, that is that cash incentive that people are counting on as part of their compensation, that's fine. That's how you structure those. That's the goal that you are trying to get for this. But what we're talking about are these contests and short-term incentives that are designed to your point. Maybe it isn't about that end result. Maybe it's about steps to the sale to get people to do things. It's about behaviors. You're trying to influence the sales force in ways that are going to be long-term impactful for your organization, but they don't have to have an immediate response. And that sometimes I think is where people get there. Well, I can't pay out if they're not performing. And you're setting the stage for future success.
Yeah, and I think we forget, or I should say we, I don't, you don't, you guys don't, but the people that need incentives and motivation and nudges to do things other than hit goal are the people that aren't hitting goal. So by limiting it to only people that achieved a goal, you're basically just saying that nobody else is worth trying to get them to do something different. And that's the whole point, is that if we spend a little bit of time and energy on the middle 60 or the bottom 30 in some cases, I can get them to move and become a high performer someday. I mean, ultimately, the big picture on all of this stuff is to try to move that entire distribution, that whole performance curve up. And these are all different ways to do that, both tactically and strategically. And so this idea that you have to hit gold to participate in any awards is just on its face kind of backwards.
Yeah. There's a lot of psychological research that supports the idea that that encouragement and a positive environment is ultimately the better strategy in the long term. That using carrots basically is more effective than using sticks. Sticks can work in very, very short term, very specific things, like when when you have a child and you say don't touch the stove. And you mean that in a very stern and harsh way because the consequences are dire. And that's a stick that is effective. But long run, we want to incorporate strategies into our business world, into our sales incentives that are more about carrots and more about creating a positive and collaborative environment rather than just, no, you can't play. You're not good enough to play, so you're out.
Out of everything. And that's the thing is it's not even you can't play in this little piece. It's just that one thing keeps me from playing in the entire game. I mean, it's bigger than that. It basically is eliminating you from any options anywhere else. It's a really bad
story, right? No more reindeer games for you.
Because you have a red nose.
Yeah. So what?
He just drank a little too much, man. Come on.
Just hitting the cocktails a little too hard.
All right.
Give him a break. What's our next sin?
Sin number 5. We'll figure it out behind the scenes. Don't worry about being transparent.
Well, isn't this totally normal? I mean, come on, you guys. I mean, the whole idea of I got to make sure that certain people win. And so I might have to pull some strings on the back end, right?
There are a lot of people that do that. That's for sure. I've run into them myself, especially when we get the winners list and I compare that to the performance. And it's like, wait a minute. And they're like, yeah, I know, but that's just the way it is. I'm like, you've got to really think this stuff through. Again, when we try to make one strategy or one tactic do too many things, this is what you end up with. You start cutting corners to make sure that these outliers are covered. And unfortunately, programs, sometimes help an individual that's a top performer, and sometimes they don't, and that's okay. Talk about privilege. I mean, my gosh, just because you're always a top performer doesn't mean you will always be a top performer. I mean, there's got to be, kind of some variability in there. So, but I think this is a big problem because I think it speaks to, in my mind, more of I don't even want to say it this way, but I think a moral issue. It talks to an ethical base. This idea of lack of transparency. As soon as that happens, what else is not being done above board? What else is not transparent? Is the guy standing next to me or the woman sitting next to me that sells getting a different commission structure? Are they getting special bonuses that I don't know about? Are they getting other perks? Because obviously they got the trip and didn't earn it. So there must be something else going on here. So it speaks to this idea of a really just opaque world that doesn't have any visibility into the real rules. So
Trust is super important in this or in any arena, right? We are dealing with people, and trust is that bedrock for what this is. And I always say people have a really good bullshit detector. For the most part, we are really good at being able to discern that. And once we see that something like this happens, all the trust that you might have built up over years all of a sudden disappears in a snap. And it is gone, and it is super hard to re-engage. I do this team build. I've not anymore so much, but used to do a lot of team building programs. And we had this one program that we had this electronic maze. It was basically looks like a big checkerboard. It's 6x9, and there's a carpet, and they step on it, and some of the squares beep, and some don't, and various different things. And as the facilitator, I would be there, and you're encouraging people going through and different things, and I'm leading them. They can't talk, so I can talk. So I'm yelling, I'm telling them stuff, and I point them in the right direction on a couple. And then at one point, and one point only, I will point to the wrong square that beeps, that doesn't no longer beep.
Misdirect them.
I misdirect them. For the rest of the time, I will always point at right squares. Nobody believes me anymore.
But they don't trust.
They don't trust me. They will actually physically get in. They grab me and pull me away because they think I'm trying to bullshit them. And every time after that, I literally point at the right one whenever I give them help. But nobody believes me because that trust has been broken. And that is exactly what happens in a situation where people go through. This is why, and to this degree, we talk about manager discretionary incentives or awards, being able to say, as a manager, you have a budget and you can reward this. And people get really scared by that because of this possibility of saying, I'm going to reward my buddies. And even though your performance is better, I'm not going to reward you.
It's going to feel like favoritism. And the bedrock for this is a lack of psychological safety. I go back to Project Aristotle, the work that Google did on trying to understand how effective teams work. And the bedrock for all of this is psychological safety. We got to feel like we're not going to be accosted or assaulted emotionally when we go to work.
Right.
And so this absolutely goes against some of the most fundamental aspects of just being human and working within a group of people. If we don't feel psychologically safe, we are not going to give our best performance.
Yeah, and I think a lot of clients also think that this is not a big deal. In other words, it's just a program, right? So we don't have to worry about it. But the reality is there's a cascade here that the minute, like you just said, like the minute I find out you're lying about this or you're not being truthful here, that cascade now is you're not truthful about anything. And so now not only just disengage me from sales or from performance, you've disengaged me from the entire organization because now everything is questionable. So this little trick to say, I want to take care of the top performer. Now think about it this way. The people that'll probably get the most upset about this and really start to freak are your top performers.
Yeah.
So this whole idea of trying to make sure and protect your top performers that they stay with the company through this recognition program, and you bend the rules a little bit because one of them is actually damaging everybody else. I think, again, it's this idea that we think all of these types of sins aren't that big a deal. And we just forget how much these things cascade after a few. Humans are just that way, right? We're built that way evolutionarily, right? We have to be paying attention to these little tiny things because that's survival of the fittest time, right? If I think there's a tiger behind that rock, it better be. And if you lie to me about it, now I can't trust you when you tell me there is one. I'm going to say, well, maybe there isn't. Maybe there is.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just a crazy component. All right. Sin number 6. We cannot let a low performer be the top winner in the contest. Very similar to some of the other sins that we've talked about, but has a nuance with it.
Yeah, I think this gets back to what we define things as and making sure that we have a good understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. When we say a top performer, what are we saying? In what? I mean, I can have your best closer. I could have the best person that's the best at discovery, finding out what the real pain is for the client. So we have to define, all right, what is low performer versus high performer? If your program is all about education and training, I may not be the top performer in sales, but I might be the top performer here. So I think this idea of only looking at top performers as people worthy, again, it's a nuance on that other one. And Tim, you've actually done, I think, a little bit more digging in on this than me, but
yeah, well, you've got it here, Paul. The psychological idea of excluding people, again, is first of all, it's a lack of psychological safety. It says you're not good enough, and which to a sales manager can often sound like that's a motivator when it's not. It's actually just a browbeating. And the other part of this is the opportunity to create something where you're going into the entire spectrum of the sales force and looking for things that are important to the sales process, right? As you said, prospecting and writing proposals and closing and all those kinds of things. And so developing an opportunity to reward people so that they feel a sense of idiosyncratic fit. to kind of get back to Ron Kivitz's work from Columbia on this idea that I can feel like I can just go out and kill this particular opportunity because you're actually designing an incentive that makes me feel like I really have some control over it. I really have some input on it, and that's so critical at engaging. Getting back to Ahern and Steenberg, this idea of not just engaging the stars, but also engaging the cores and the laggers.
Yeah.
Now we have an opportunity to bring a broader spectrum of performance into the incentive world and improve performance overall.
It's the more people rowing the boat, all together, you're going to have faster and better boat, right? If you just depend on those top people at the front of the boat who are really strong, but the rest of the boat is just either not doing it or not doing it well, then you're not getting the maximum output that you can. And so this is about saying, look, let's get everybody on the boat rowing together and doing the things. And it doesn't matter if you're at the very end and you are the lowest of the low performers. If you improve, that improvement helps everybody. And if you improve the most, and that's what you're trying to do, then, hey, that's a great thing.
Exactly. I mean, you would never. I get yelled at this sometimes for doing this, but I always try to also back this into that 90% of people out there are good parents, right? And if you've got more than a couple of kids, you would never treat your children exactly the same and measure them exactly the same and reward them exactly the same, because everybody that has kids knows for a fact every kid's different. Every kid's different motivationally. Every kid's different on what they like. Some kids like, chemistry sets, and some kids like bikes, whatever. So when we have that rewards discussion, that falls into there. But even under this performance area too, is I've got a daughter that can draw like nobody's business, and I have a son who he can't make a stick figure. So I'm not going to give them an incentive for drawing. I mean, it's just not going to or that will be the only one. And I think we have to look at everything in all of this stuff. We should be thinking in terms of people being multidimensional. Your process is multidimensional. There is not one way to do anything anymore, just like there isn't a single target client that everybody looks exactly like this. So I think approaching this from a portfolio kind of approach is about the only way it makes any sense, is to say, look, accept the fact that everybody's different, every situation's different, and there's probably 6, 10, 100 million things that you can look at that'll drive your business, whatever your goal is. Try to at least encompass that from a manageable standpoint, keep as many as you can, not too many that it's hard to do, but not too few that you start to punish people. And again, it gets back to, I can't keep saying this over and again, it's back to this idea of path of least resistance. It's just easier to do the wrong thing. But you know what? All these sins, it's easier, even in real sins, it's easier to do the sin than to not do the sin, right?
Yeah. It takes more work. And yet, isn't this part of the beauty of an incentive, some kind of a short-term spurt, something that over the course of a month or a couple of months really draws the focus of the sales force so that you can change things up? You can change things up on a very regular basis. But
I think that's those of us that look at it that way are probably a little bit more attuned to the technology that's available today. And one of the things we haven't mentioned through any of this is it isn't really technology driven. These are all human issues, but technology gives us the ability today to write better incentive programs. In the old days where it cost $150,000 to run a program, you pick the one big blunt object, the trip to Hawaii, because you were going to have have $100,000 behind it. But now that I can have the ability to launch, stop, start 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and I don't have that huge hurdle, I can design better programs. So technology doesn't drive your program, but your technology allows for better program design.
That's a great point.
Yeah, very much so.
Sin number 7. It's all about the Benjamins.
Love this one.
Tim has written papers on this one over and above what we just did.
Yeah, don't we have another? Isn't there another movie reference on this? Something about "Show me the money."
Yeah. There's a lot. There's a lot. More money, more problems. There's a lot of references out there when it comes to money. That's for sure. And again, this is probably the grandfather of all. Let's just do it the easy way. Every company that you're going to run a program for pays their employees or has some sort of mechanism to pay their distribution channel. They don't have to create anything other than a PDF that they email out, and then they just add some money to the paycheck, or they add some money to the next bill, that the invoice that goes out or comes in or whatever. The system exists. I don't have to do anything. I can just throw it in there, and it's just simple and done. And yeah, I understand that. But again, the goal of this is to have an impact, and they're missing a lot of things, especially, I'm not even talking, that's just the operational and functional part of why this is a bad idea. But when we get into all of the, and again, this is the one that I think bothers me the most, because there's probably the most data available than all of these sins. I could convince people of 1 through 6 without even blinking. You get to this one, though, and for some reason, everybody wants to argue with you. And it's like the data for this is huge. There's so much data around why money is not the best way to drive performance and to nudge behaviors and change things. It astounds me that you can present all of this, and then the client will look across the table and go, yeah, but money works.
Well, but this is going back to our component that you can rationally do this. And if you were a classical economist, you would predict that money would be a better motivator. It should be, because the money is fungible. You can spend the money on whatever satisfies your desire. So the person you talked about earlier with the motorcycle, they want a motorcycle. They can buy a motorcycle. If you wanted the trip to Hawaii, you can buy the trip to Hawaii. If you wanted, to spend it on, art, or, if you just wanted to, put it in a bathtub and burn it, whatever, gets your goad going, right? I mean, that's what a classical economist would say. Yet we, as you said, we don't operate that way, because we are human. And because we are human, we don't go through all of those components. And the way that money gets processed in the brain is very different than a tangible reward. And it becomes this element that has, and you cannot have, you feel guilty about spending it on things that are luxurious or hedonic in nature, right? You have this component of feeling like I need to pay my bills with it. To Paul, to your point, when it gets put into a check like that, sometimes it doesn't even get noticed, right? You don't always aren't looking at that, so it doesn't have that wow effect. We don't talk about money, particularly in America. Like, I got a $5,000 bonus or a $10,000 bonus. I can talk about getting that motorcycle. I can talk about earning that
not
trip
about
to Hawaii.
the cash equivalent.
Can't talk about the cash equivalent. There's a whole number of rationale things that again, Paul, to your point, there's so much research out here that it just boggles the mind that people still think that this is a thing to do.
Well, and speaking of the research, I think about one of the seminal works was Dan Ariely and James Heyman's work on the Tale of Two Markets, showing the tremendous difference between the way the social exchange happens with a tangible reward versus a financial exchange. Scott Jeffrey and Victoria Schaefer did a tremendous paper under Hal Arkus's direction a bunch of years ago on tangible rewards, and again compared how do people perform. It's not just about preference. It's actually about how people behave and what they do, the kind of results they deliver when a non-monetary reward is offered. And there's more. We'll make sure to link them in the show notes.
But and to that, this is another component, that the rational aspect. Money will drive up performance. You will get most likely you will get an increase in performance above baseline. The research, though, points out to this fact that if you had offered a tangible reward of equal nature, that performance increase is oftentimes double to triple what the cash performance increase
so
is.
They're leaving results on the table.
You're leaving performance on the table.
And not by an insignificant amount.
No, not at all.
It's like double in some cases, right? So
double, triple.
Yeah. So, and even when you tell people that, they still say, yeah, but money works. I'm like, it doesn't work well. And, as you guys, I was just thinking about it. I hadn't thought about this in years until we're just chatting now. But do you remember this story? It's now 12 years old. So this is, about the guy who traded a paperclip for something. And then at the end of the chain, he actually got a brand new house.
Yeah.
He started with a paperclip. And the point of that whole story, the reason this struck me is if I had come to somebody and said, I have $1 and I'll trade you that dollar for $2, somebody's going to say, well, why would I do that? That's the stupidest bet in the world, right? It's the stupidest thing to do. Oh, wait, make it $1.50. Nobody's going to do that until it's exactly $1 or less. But the paperclip isn't money. The paperclip represents something else. There's some utility to it. There's a connection there that's over and above the just the fungibility of $1 being worth $1. Because in that guy, the guy that traded it for a pen, say, needed a paperclip, but he didn't need a pen, right? And then the pen got traded for this, and the pen but each trade, the value exchange was different because the people valued things differently. And I think that they would not have done that if it was all cash. So that, to me, that's a really good way to explain the difference between cash versus non-cash having a different value in people's minds, whether it's hedonic or something else.
We're also not very good. We think we're really good, but we're really not very good at knowing the price of everything. And this is why The Price is Right is the longest running TV game show. It's because everybody who watches thinks, oh, of course I'm going to get on there and I'm going to know exactly what those prices are. But we don't know. We really don't know the exact prices of all these things. And because we're not Amazon, right? That's that's why Amazon exists, is to keep track of all the prices. And so when we are in this situation where we're comparing two things, where we're comparing, well, what would be how much effort would I exchange for a trip to Hawaii versus how much effort would I exchange for a trip to Rome? Well, those are completely emotional things. They're not going to be based on a financial exchange. They're going to be based on emotional or social exchanges, which drives more motivation overall.
This whole part of this is also, I think, wrapped up into a longer discussion about goal setting, about even in a point program where you're not awarding money and you're awarding points that are redeemable for tangibles. Until you make the decision to convert that mentally from the points or the dollars into the tangible, that connection doesn't exist yet. It's still a medium of exchange. And I think what we're finding, and I think one of the things that these cash versus non-cash type studies get to, is they always ask you to compare cash to some item or something or some event, something that has boundaries, something that isn't just, it's not like compare cash to 10,000 points. Because there's no hedonic value to 10,000 points. I need to create that image of what it is I'm going to do. And I think this is a big, big downfall, and something I've been really harping on lately is that it's hard to get people, and it's important though, I think, to get people to set a goal in a program, to say, what do you want to do if you hit some of these milestones and you earn some of these points or you earn these different incentives? What are you going to do? What does that mean to you? Get them to actually say or write down or commit. I mean, we can talk about Cialdini and commitment, right? Put down what it is that represents to you, because now I've converted that from just earning points to earning the chemistry set for Mary, or the bike for Bobby, or the whatever bling for your spouse or your significant other. That just changes that whole discussion about what are you doing. It's it's the two bricklayers, right? I'm building a wall, I'm building a cathedral. And until you have that vision, it's still, that we need to make sure in all of these programs we convert that process into some sort of tangible thing.
Well, and I think that's a really good point, because oftentimes when we're thinking about cash, and right, if you did a survey out there, and then people do this, right? They survey their people, and what reward do you want? And 70 to 80% is always cash. We are not good estimators of what actually motivates us. We have a very myopic view that isn't very accurate, right? The accuracy of what actually drives us at that, subconscious to even conscious level to a certain degree isn't there. And that gets to a key piece when we, at least in some of the conversations I've had with clients, is, well, my people want cash. They're asking for cash. And you go, yes, they are, which is wonderful. But what are you trying to achieve with this? And sometimes if people don't understand their own motivations, you have to be, the person that comes in and says, well, we can help in actually driving it longer. And to your point of setting that goal, of visualizing that goal, people don't think that that's going to actually help. Well, why would I need to do that? Well, it does. There's actual research that points to that.
Well, along the lines of visualization, there was a story about some of the linemen from the University of Missouri football team. This is a dozen, 15, maybe 20 years ago, a long time ago. And they were convinced that year, their biggest competition were the Cornhuskers from University of Nebraska. And so some of the linemen went to Cornhusker Stadium and stole a small patch of grass from the end zone. And they brought it back to their locker room, and they said, "This is the grass that we want to have our knees in, and our faces in, and our bodies in, because this is the end zone grass at Cornhusker Stadium, and this is what we want." So they made it so tangible and so real that they brought it really, literally, right into their locker room. And I thought, what a great way to visualize and to make the commitment to it. Now, I'm not endorsing that you should go and steal something from a stadium. That's not just.
You heard it here first. Vandalism is the way to performance.
No, that's not the message.
There we go.
But it was passionate. It was a very passionate commitment.
All right.
So I totally.
So with that, Paul, I've got, one of the things we like to talk about here on Behavioral Grooves is music, and I've got a musical question for you.
Well, wait, I'm looking at the visual of Paul here, and there's a guitar case in the back. Did you see that?
Yes, there is. And there's my guitars right there next to the TV.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. All right, ask your musical question now.
Well, Paul, I know that you've moved around.
Yes.
In a variety of different places throughout the United States in your life, right?
Overseas as well. Born in Paris.
So what I'm wondering is, we talk about context mattering.
Yeah.
Did your musical tastes change based on where you were living? Did you start to listen, and did you create playlists that were heavily influenced by the environment that you were living in?
Not really. No. I mean, first of all, my my playlist is really time sensitive. It's a phase. It's a portion of life versus and it covers. It's interesting because it covers two different distinct buckets. And I actually read something somewhere that your playlist is typically a function of when in your life you felt happiest and most fulfilled. You will typically pick music from that era because that will remind you of how you felt there. So it's not just being exposed to it and liking it at different stages. You typically just end up reverting back to, I felt good during this time period. Music in that time period was X. Therefore, it just kind of, again, back to not knowing what we don't know about ourselves. It's one of those things. So in my mind, I have two different genres. I have like from 75, 74 to about 83 is one block. And then I have a block from about 95, 96 to about 2006. And if I look at my playlist, I fall into those two groups. And one is, high school, college, kind of, no cares, no worries, doing pretty much what you wanted until my father saw the grade cards and my loans came due. Then it was when I took a job in sales, actually, for as an incentive sales guy, and I just had a blast doing it. I had so much fun, and we moved to a new neighborhood. We moved down here to South Carolina. The kids were young. It was just a great time. So when I look after having read that and then looking at my playlist, there are those two chunks of time that are predominant in my playlist. There's a few, obviously, but they typically. There's a few from this year or last year or the year before, but those are typically reminiscent of and influenced or informed by other songs from those other periods.
If I could, would it be fair to say that you were influenced in context in two particular periods, but you disregarded context in others?
I just don't remember it having impact. When I lived in Virginia, I was very young, like second, third grade, that kind of thing. When we lived in Japan, we didn't listen. The only other time I can remember is when we lived in New York, that was the first time I ever had my own bedroom. I have two brothers and three sisters, so there's six of us, and we weren't wealthy by any stretch. So for most of my life, we were three to a room. We had 3-bedroom house, right, and 6 kids. So I had the first time I ever had my own room was when I was in the 6th grade. So I started recording music off the radio with a reel-to-reel, and I still remember that. And I do have songs like "Eve of Destruction" by Barry McGuire. It's like one of my all-time, because I remember recording that off the radio. I remember "Timothy" by the Boys being one of those songs that sticks out. I can remember in the 6th grade, band called, I think it was called, I can't remember if the band was called DOA or if the song was called DOA.
The song was DOA. I remember it.
And the band had some sort of also weird, like Blood something name or something like that. But I remember that because a kid threw up in the cafeteria when somebody was playing that song in the cafeteria because it was so graphic, according to him anyway. So, little things like that. But yeah, so I guess those are place, but they're, specific. But I don't think it had, it was mostly, other than being in Japan and Paris, it was kind of just America, right? It was, my life was all military bases. So it was even though it might have been California, Alabama, Virginia, New York, they were all military bases, pretty similar.
So the context was the environment was still heavily influenced by the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Military. Yeah. Everybody I knew, father wore a uniform to work every day. And, we all went to the same school. We all saw each other at the PX and blah, blah, blah. So we were enclaved.
Where is the radio source that got you these songs that sound very American? Were you still listening to? Is there a
that was U.S. Well, that was U.S. When I was recording in the 6th grade. That was based in upstate New York. In Japan, like I said, we were out running around. I tell this to people and they don't believe me, but when I was 10 years old, when you're 10 years old in the military, you get your first military ID, and we lived just outside of Tokyo. And when I turned 10, I got my military ID. You could go off base with a military ID. So me and my buddies, we'd just go off and wander around the suburbs of Tokyo. And that was perfectly acceptable. Nobody complained. My parents were like, yeah, we just tell them we're going off base. Great. Nobody cared. So we spent most of our time running around. There was we didn't have a TV. My dad didn't even have a TV. We didn't bother. He said, well, it's all going to be in Japanese, so why bring it over? So he stored it while we were in Japan. We didn't even have a TV, except he did buy one when the moon landing happened. He wanted to make sure that we saw the moon landing.
Well, and did you see the moon landing?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. You weren't deprived.
No.
That's terrific. Well, Paul, thank you so much for being a guest on Behavioral Grooves. This was fun
like part
talking
of the family.
about the 7 deadly sins. And we're going to make sure that there's a link in the show notes to make sure that everyone can get to the ebook
you bet.
out there. Any closing thoughts?
Download the ebook. And just check yourself. I tell everybody this is just take a step back and recognize you don't think correctly about this stuff. You just have to take that extra step and say, is that really true? And just do that. You'll be surprised. And Google's your friend. If you think there might be a better way, probably Google it. Not only because your name and Kurt's name and my name might come up in that search, but now I think, download the ebook.
Terrific. Well, thanks very much, Paul. We're grateful for you being on the show today.
Yeah, absolutely. And anytime you need some help, let me know.
Thanks, Paul.
All right.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our Behavioral Grooves interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our very sinful minds.
Right, because we were not the sin committers. We were the rectifiers.
We have all committed sins.
Well, agreed.
Incentive sins. That's what did you think I was talking about?
Sins, like sins. That's what I thought you were talking about.
Well, that may be Behavioral Grooves right there. There you go.
one of our many. Okay, so what struck you? First of all, it was fun to talk with Paul. Always fun.
Oh, it is always fun to talk with Paul.
What really grabbed you in our conversation?
Well, so I don't think there wasn't any one. We talked all of the 7 sins, and we had written this paper together with him, and we've done a webinar with him. So it's a great kind of overview of all of that. So really encourage people to go and download the ebook and watch the webinar if you want to get further into this, because there's some really good information in there that we just touched the surface of here.
Yeah.
But I think the bigger picture for me is thinking about this from a more meta perspective. In all of these sins that we've identified around incentives, they all come from these false or misunderstood beliefs of human motivation, or often come from that. So for instance, and there's always a rational component. There's always a rational justification for each of those sins. But understanding that as humans, that as people who are driven by emotion as opposed to being driven necessarily by our prefrontal cortex rational decision-making minds, we make these errors. We make these errors in judgment. And that goes a long way across multitude of fields, but particularly from an incentive perspective. So
right. Their bias, this is where our biases come
exactly
through, right? And so while we are well-intended, especially the designers of incentive programs are well-intended.
Yes.
Because they want to drive results. They want to do what's good for the company. They want to do what's good for their own job. I'm sure that no one wants to hurt the sales reps that they're designing for. It's not like they're not well-intended. It's just that they're not armed with the best information to do that.
Well, and we know this, right? I mean, it's one of the things that behavioral science points out over and over and over again, is that our biases are such that we can't see them in ourselves.
That's right. You can't read the label from inside the jar. You just can't.
Whoa, I have never heard that one before. Yeah. I thought you were going to say the label when you're wearing the shirt. I don't know.
Well, that would work too.
Yeah, okay, well, there. We came up with a new
I like two.
idiom.
I like both of them.
But to that point, we don't understand the biases that are acting upon us when we're in that design mode.
Right.
And that's why behavioral science can sometimes shed that light. And I think it's a really important light. And that's why sometimes it's really good to get an outside perspective, having somebody come in to say, hey, yes, this is this is done really well, but did you think about how this is actually going to impact how people psychologically interpret this, how it's communicated, how it gets interpreted inside the sales rep's mind, and what that does? Because as we talked about, the unintended consequences of these can be significant.
Well, I just can't imagine why sales managers don't reach out more to get more outside help, because their job is really hard. And I think I mentioned this when we were talking to Paul, but golly Moses, they're asked to be economists. They have to predict the future. They have to assess market conditions. They've got to plan for their own reps. They've got to be psychologists.
Yes.
They have to kind of get inside the heads of their customers and get inside the heads of their sales reps to figure out the motivational things. They have to be babysitters. They've got to they got to watch out for all these silly little things. Don't touch the stove, and no, you can't have another cookie. And they've got to do all the job is a complex and hard job to be a sales manager. And one of my thoughts is, why the hell don't they reach out and say, I need help designing an effective sales incentive program?
Budget. They don't have budget.
They don't have budget. Oh, to actually go out and get that help.
To go out and get that help. I mean, I think that is a huge thing.
But it's money well spent.
It is, in my belief. It is really well spent, particularly when you think about. So the thing is that it has all of these unintended consequences, and maybe even more importantly is these missed opportunities.
Yeah, missed opportunities is a big deal.
So you think about this. You think about, yes, unintended consequences. It could go south. It could go bad. But oftentimes it's more about cash is actually a good, it's a motivator, and it will drive increases in performance in a short-term contest if it's used as the reward. But it's not going to improve as much as a tangible reward, that trip or the merchandise or some selection of those components. And that's the piece that gets left.
Right. And of course, what accompanies a good reward in the most effective programs is a good design.
Yeah.
And it's too easy to get, again, to kind of go to the easiest. Oh, I'll just reward the top 5 reps because they're the big dogs. They pull the sled. And it's like, no, get everybody rowing the boat. That's much better. And another way that I was thinking about this, which is very similar to exactly what you're talking about, Kurt, is switching out the difficult question for the easy question. The difficult question is, what rewards and rules do I need to design that will absolutely maximize my results? And that's the harder question to answer than an easy question like, well, which rewards and design would I prefer? Right. So my preference is really easy to answer. And too often sales managers are in the situation where they're just going to answer the easy question. Okay, I think I would like this. We've both had the examples of the sales manager that just came back from Hawaii and said, we got to do a trip to Hawaii, or just got their motorcycle license and said, we got to make sure that a motorcycle is the top delivered reward.
That VP that says, well, this worked when I was a rep, right?
Yeah, right. Or that one, yeah.
But
that doesn't necessarily answer the harder question. What's going to drive the optimal results in this situation is a different question.
Well, and it goes
a harder question to answer.
And it goes back to your point earlier about all of the different roles that these sales managers and sales leaders and VPs need to have, right? They are the economist, they are the motivator, they are the psychologist, all of those factors.
Right.
And so as Roger Dooley, when we talk to him, that's just one more piece of friction. And so answering that harder question has more friction involved, and so people are less likely to do it.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you about live music. So occasionally we get to talk about live music.
Okay. What about, I like live music.
Yeah, I know you do. And so, and we haven't talked about live music recently. So I wanted to ask you, we live here in Minneapolis, the home of First Avenue.
Woohoo!
Which is pretty amazing.
It is.
It became an iconic place to go because of Prince's Purple Rain movie.
Yes.
But you've been to many concerts at First Ave.
It has been a while, but yes, I used to frequent there quite often.
Okay, so what are your top 3, 4, memories, concert experiences at the amazing First Ave?
There's lots and lots. So obviously one is a local band that morphed into 2 other kind of my favorite bands, but Trick Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Who then disbanded after the mid 90s, and then they became Dan Wilson then
Matt Wilson left, and Dan Wilson came in to form Semisonic.
Well, Dan Wilson, Matt's brother, and the bass player
John Munson,
and he had a different drummer, and they formed Semisonic, and then Dan went off on his own and co-wrote all those words for Adele and the Dixie Chicks, and then moved off to LA.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Trick
Shakespeare, and they did this rendition of a song called "The Pants," which if anybody has seen it live, it is by far one of the best live performances. They were a great live band. They were a semi successful studio band. They didn't capture the same energy in their studio albums that they did in a live performance. But The Pants, where they all started playing, they all played the drums at one point. And anyway, it was cool.
Okay. What else?
Tragically Hip,
okay.
One of my favorite Canadian bands of all time. And again, in First Avenue, I remember I was up on the ramp kind of component and looking out over the crowd as they're playing these songs, and it was amazing.
It's kind of a magical place.
It is a magical place. Yeah. And then Morphine, who is a band that they have a 2-string bass and a saxophone. The guy plays 2 saxophones at once and a drummer, and that is the entirety of their band. And it's this deep, resonant kind of sound. And again, just the vibe in there and the crowd. Everybody knew every song, and it was great. And of course, as I'm thinking about this, all of these. So the lead singer for Tragically Hip has passed away. The lead singer for Morphine has passed away. Trick Shakespeare is no longer.
Yeah, everybody's still alive.
They're still alive, yes. But they might get back for a reunion. Who knows?
Every now and then you see Matt and Dan getting together, the brothers.
Yeah.
I actually saw Matt and Dan at Actually, I saw them at another local venue, but not at
The Women's Club? Is that it?
No. It was the Hopkins Center for Performing Arts.
All right. So you, First Ave. What are your First Avenue memories?
My first favorite show was Semisonic.
Oh, yeah?
Actually, yeah, with Dan Wilson, and that was pretty cool. Just because they're really a damn good band. Aside from having hits written by Harvard graduate Dan Wilson, they're also really just a super good band. Lucius would be my number 2.
I don't know Lucius.
So Lucius, I'll link him in the show notes. It's a duet female duet based out of Boston, and they are fantastic vocalists and songwriters.
Cool.
They're just awesome, and with a great pop edge, and they're very edgy.
Pop and edgy.
Yeah,
Pop edge.
Pop
Is that
edge.
what,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, it's very fun. And my link into the next group is that at the end of the Lucius show, they came back out. And one of the First Avenue is a big barn basically, but it's cool.
It's an old bus depot.
Old bus depot, yeah. So they walked off the stage with a single microphone, came down into the center of the audience on the main floor, and who came out but 2 of the vocalists from Trampled by Turtles.
Oh,
And they did a song in the center of all the people on the main floor with one microphone and one acoustic guitar, and they all kind of snuggled up to one microphone, and they did a tune. And I thought that was so cool. And that leads to my last show. Trampled by Turtles at First Ave was really a great show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
they're from Duluth, right?
Yes,
they're
they're another Minnesota band. Yeah. So
all right.
That would be good. Oh, one other. Just for the sake of Minneapolis bands, and The Professor, and just a pretty terrific band, and I'll link to show notes. But thoughtful singer-songwriter, but with a rock edge to it. Just really good stuff. So
Okay.
yeah, and The Professor.
Have you seen anything at the 7th Street entry, the little
Yes.
performance stage that is next to it, connected but
Tiny.
tiny?
I will say the most recently I saw the Mighty Pines there.
Oh.
And they blew it out. They just totally rocked that room. They did a great job. How about you?
I saw an Estonian band there called Ewert and the Two Dragons.
No way. That's the name of the band?
Yeah, and they are an awesome band. And we had an Estonian au pair who said, you got to go. It got me hooked on the band, and then said they're coming, and so we all went, and it was a great show. And
wow,
it's such a small venue too that you're right there, and and then we got to meet them because obviously the Estonians were talking Estonian to each other, and I'm right there, so that was cool.
Estonians. First of all, that's just, when was the last time we ever talked about Estonians? Wow, that we just crossed into new territory there.
Yes, there we go.
Excellent. So, listeners, thank you for hanging out with us today. Thank you for supporting us and sharing the message. We often ask for reviews, but if you've got a friend or a colleague or someone that you know that you think might be able to benefit a little bit, especially from this episode about sales incentives, just send them a link. Send them a link to this episode. Help them be a more successful sales manager. That would be our hope.
We would really appreciate it, and thank you for listening.